in its lower income neighborhoods, and that leads to solutions now as we finally begin to grapple with this idea of how crowded the city has become and is becoming, and the fact that we haven't set aside a significant open space leads to solutions, I think, sort of half brilliant and half desperate, like the Hollywood Central Freeway Park, which would take this section of the 101 freeway as it runs through a very densely populated section of Hollywood and cap it over with a park. And it's, this project is very much, this is not a final design by any means, it's very much in the early stages. There is some funding to study it at this point, but it's a symbol again of the particular kind of infill projects that we're seeing in Los Angeles that are unique to Southern California. And in that sense, it couldn't come at a more interesting time or be more perfectly designed. So it, again, is representative in a lot of ways of the kinds of subjects I'm particularly keen to cover as a critic. So for me, to get back to the theme of the conference today, writing the city really means trying to find projects like this, which are ways to talk not just about architecture, landscape architecture, design, but also where those subjects intersect with urbanism and the future of the city. So I'll leave it there. Thank you. Okay, great.
Thank you very much to our presenters and to our audience for your interest in the subject matter. We're going to start the second session at 4 o'clock, so even though some of you might relish a short break at this point, you're not going to get it. I think we'll get started, and I think the best way to start, we've heard great stuff from all 5 of our presenters, is to welcome your questions, and we'll let the discussion grow out of that. So, yes, so if our speakers would sit behind their name tags, we'll get going, and would love to hear your comments, questions, responses. Are these? Yes. Thank you. Fire away, Bill. Yes.
On? I can't tell. Okay. I had a question that's sort of a combination of Dean Rubin's comments about the newspaper. I was hoping he'd be here, so I was wondering if oh, he just moved. Okay. Whether he thought the survival of it had meant that it needed to still be on paper. And then I was also thinking about Jan Abrams' talk, because I'm wondering if she has any thoughts about the look of American newspapers and whether some of these really creative graphic designs that you're doing could be applied to newspapers to jazz them up a little bit and to make them more readable and more exciting things to hold in your hand if it's still on paper.
Can you just ask the question simply again? What could better designed U.S. newspapers rescue them from the internet? Is that the question, basically?
Not maybe not rescue them, but just make them more exciting things to look at and to read.
The answer is yes, obviously. They could be better designed.
Are there any ones that you know of, the papers that have been? I know the Guardian's gone through a big
Well, they've
redesign
gone
it?
through several. I mean, the Berliner format, which they just adopted a year ago, is the one after the generation that Simon Esterson designed, which you can see the resemblance. I want to say that I have my questions about the look. I mean, I reference a little bit of this. I've written extensively about architectural photography as a mode of seduction, and this wasn't the occasion to repeat that talk. So I don't want you to go away thinking that I'm a sort of simple, clear advocate of big mastheads and big, bold headlines and giant full-bleed images, because I think that was true of that era. It was a very bold thing then, and I was just in the library and realizing that practically every magazine about architecture now is big men faces on the cover with high color. So it's not as if it's unique, or at least not unique anymore. I perhaps should have shown what the stablemates were in England at the time, what the graphics were, by contrast to which this really burst onto the scene. Icon, for example, exists now as a direct rival to Blueprint, both in periodicity and in layout, trim size. I think the point that Dean Rubin is making is the one we need to go further in, is how can the work that critics do be assisted by close relationship with art direction, whether in print or online. And I've really been more involved with print production at the Institute than the web, but we're moving in that direction. And I certainly, before I went to the university, was very engaged in writing about interaction design, the sort of emerging web in the 90s at ID. And I think that there's a lot of potential, not just for kind of delivering databases or clickable links or people's email addresses, because frankly, so what if readers post a response? Does that make what they say significant? I wrote down during your presentation, I think, what is the role of the critic in the age of public posting to the internet? Because the sheer quantity of response doesn't necessarily correlate to depth of understanding or of moving the argument further along. And maybe I'll just sort of pause there and let other people jump in.
Dana?
I want to ask a question that was underlying some of my thoughts as I was listening to people talk, which was this conference was called Writing the City. And I took that to mean something about the difference between writing urbanism versus writing architecture. And I'd be really interested in hearing some of your thoughts about what the medium of the written word can do for urban public understanding or urban design and its projective possibilities that's different from architectural criticism and architectural journalism.
Do we have a taker? Sure. Christopher?
I can start. I think it's a particularly good question for Los Angeles, which, of course, is in the midst of these great changes and doesn't have the kind of tradition of discourse around a lot of those issues that a city like New York does. That's one of the things that surprised me, even sort of knowing that, but it still surprised me that the extent to which that's true. Coming to Los Angeles, and one of the first things, I'll just give one brief example, one of the first subjects I wrote about was the preservation battle over the Ambassador Hotel on Wilshire Boulevard, which, as many of you know, has an interesting combination of architectural and cultural and political significance as a designed by Myron Hunt. It's also the site of the first 5 or 6 Academy Award ceremonies, also the place where Bobby Kennedy was shot. And the Los Angeles Unified School District wanted the site for a school. So it was sort of a perfect case study for preservation. It wasn't a developer who wanted to put up a skyscraper there. It was a school district that was expanding and desperately needed to put a school in that neighborhood, which had been underserved for decades, and kids were being sent over to the San Fernando Valley and being sent on these 1-hour bus rides to get to their school. So it was in New York, it would have been the kind of story that people were debating that was on the front page of the newspapers, and there was a kind of silence about it in Los Angeles that really surprised me. Even when I called the planning director, even when I called people whose job ostensibly is to be talking and worrying and thinking and working on these issues. So I think in a place like Los Angeles, there is a need for new kinds of ways to talk about these and new kinds of platforms, I think, more importantly, for discussion, and that's even in an age of declining newspaper readership, it's certainly something that we can do from the print side.
Yeah.
think Chris is actually a great example of an architecture urban critic who writes about both and ends up writing a lot about the issue of public space or the unprivate city. And I think there are two big reasons that we haven't been having urban design writers or urbanism writers that have to do with the last 100 years and the period of modernism. And one of them is the focus on objects. And an architecture building is an object. And we have focused on the object as opposed to the space between the objects, or the larger context. And the second thing that's related to that is that newspapers also have categories. And where do you put that? I mean, does it go in art, or does it go in real estate or business? You know, it has to do with everything. So newspapers fell into the, well, where do we put that, or is that a topic? And writers fell into the, well, let's write about the building. So it's the same thing in academia. I mean, our urban design programs and our programs on cities either don't exist, or they fall in all different kinds of programs and departments and are hard to categorize. And this is a relic of the last century. Really of the modern period. And I think, and this is part of what I write about in Integral Urbanism, I think it's starting to change. I mean, people are realizing that there's a huge disconnect, and that's why we talk about the connected oasis and the connected corridor. Our lives have gotten fragmented, our cities have gotten fragmented, our academic institutions have gotten fragmented, our everything. And what we're trying, so many people in so many realms are trying to do now is to defragment. You know how when your computer needs to be defragmented because it's got too much stuff and it's disorganized, and you defragment it. Another way of saying that is you integrate it. And I think the word sustainability that we hear so much all the time now, I think that's why people are interested in sustainability. Sustainability is about bringing it all back together in a way in which we can provide settings for our lives where we can really thrive, not simply survive and get through the day, but wonderful places in which we can, you know, fulfill our greatest aspirations.
I think Julia has a follow-up.
One thing, Dana, that I heard in two of the presentations, at least, in terms of our sort of Sun Belt presenter and our Rust Belt presenter, Nan and Sean, was some discussion of urban strategy, mainly connection or disconnection. And I have a question for you both about that. I mean, Nan, in your writing, you suggest that you start with the positive, and you talk about things that are going right and things that could be made better. And Sean, you talked a lot about what's not right about our cities in the Rust Belt, let's say. And I was wondering, and perhaps overlooking some of the initiatives downtown that are doing the things you're saying is missing. And I'm wondering how you think your readers respond to that as a kind of strategy of writing, a strategy of the kind of hit them hard, this is what's missing, this is bad, or versus the, you know, this is really positive. It would be great if you could each respond to that. You too, Sean.
You know, I have only read one of Sean's columns. I'm not sure if there's that much of a difference. It might, I mean, in terms of presentation, we obviously have a different personal style, but I'm not sure if in terms of the work we're actually that different. When I say that I emphasize the strains, I don't mean that I look through the world through rose-colored glasses and that I'm never critical. I mean that it's just like anyone. I mean, every single one of us has our gifts. And we also really have things we're not good at. But if we're only told about the things we're not good at, well, we'll probably start getting bad at the things we're good at, too. I really believe in in carrots rather than sticks. I really believe in positive reinforcement. And so when I say building on our strengths, you know, a whole article might just be about our strengths. Or I might start with, well, the plan looks really good. You know, it has all these good components. But, you know, to make it stronger, we should do that. I just think it's the way that we are as humans. It's asset building. Social workers call it asset-based community building. Psychologists work with the same concept. You work with individual strengths. You work with community strengths. And what you end up doing as a result is instead of creating a vicious cycle down or a vicious spiral down, you create a virtuous spiral up. So you spiral up instead of spiraling down. That's my philosophy.
Can I'll try and sort of take a swoop at both these questions in one shot here. It seems to me that everything with column writing is knowing and understanding your audience. And you've got now, my sense is that in a lot of these upstate cities, a huge majority of my audience are people whose grandparents probably lived in the city. The city becomes the original city-state. They don't come from overseas anymore. They remember the city, and they either miss it, love it, or hate it, especially downtown, right? So immediately, if you're writing about downtown, you have an audience. So I think if you bring that to the table to start with, one point I wanted to make to you, what you were talking about, urbanism and column, what I can do in that sense. Let me give you this example, 2 examples in Syracuse. There's a barbecue joint downtown called the Dinosaur Barbecue. It's over, you might even want to go there before you leave. It's a huge success. They've opened one in Harlem now, and it's attracted a lot of attention. But it was started by a couple of bikers. It was a dive, corner bar. They went in there and they started selling barbecue originally and then expanded into this sort of blues club. But there's no parking. People get towed all the time, and people come from all over hell to go there. They park across the street at this bakery where they get towed. And in a sense, without understanding it, they're partaking in what we're talking about, right? Now, at the same time, I can write a column about a Walgreens going into a residential neighborhood, and people will say, well, you know, why shouldn't we put this Walgreens on the corner and blow away a couple of houses and set it back from the street and make it in a place where it's a pain in the ass to walk across the parking lot and pretty much maim the neighborhood, but it's economic development and tax dollars, correct? So what you can do as a columnist is just say, well, why is it that there's a million Walgreens around and you don't really particularly go to them unless you have to, but you'll drive downtown and go to the Dinosaur and risk getting your car towed? That's urban design, right?
Emphasizing the strengths. I mean, I think that's Christopher's strength, if anything, is that he's kind of obsessed by weird stuff that's going on, the things that we don't expect, and then you have a way as a journalist to open a subject to a reader that might not otherwise get what's going on. And to me, that's a very different way of addressing what the dean said at the very beginning, which is, how do you explain the world to me, and why don't you do that? And if you're only going to explain traffic jams, you're not going to get very far. It requires, I think, the burden is on you to go past that and notice, you know, these kinds of urbanisms that nobody realizes what's going on, and say, you know, this is actually what you're doing here, and therefore, look at the different possibilities that exist.
I want to respond because I think so much of this is in the hands of the editor, not the writer. And you mentioned the kind of balkanization. There's a piece I skipped about the way that it's really tough even to get the real estate of an architecture column in a newspaper. And what you really want is that kind of roving that you alluded to, Jonathan, when you talked about the kinds of connections you could be making, the kinds of stories that you could be writing that encompass, you know, you don't want to slice it just via a building every time, but that tends to be the way stories are built. And why is that? Because it's a lot more work to do all that research, to maintain all those connections. It's hard enough getting the images out of the PR person for the architect's office before some other magazine gets it, let's be frank. How do you expect a poor, you know, benighted architecture critic to also be able to stay on top of the real estate aspect, look at the funders, the landowners? Those are the beats of other people in the paper, and it's very hard to even compete with them, let alone collaborate. I mean, my experience at The Independent was there were 2 other people writing about architecture, and you couldn't step into their space, and I think the same is even true at the Times, that there's a differential between who's allowed to make critical comments and who's allowed to report. So it's actually a question of how are we training for the next generation of people who will be more broadly versed and more energetic and more rapacious in what they go out to write stories, and how are they going to convince editors that that stuff is important?
I think I just think, briefly, I think that raises a really important question. Jonathan mentioned Ground Zero and Hurricane Katrina, and I think the lessons of those 2 disasters really are about architecture critics needing to address all of those things. It doesn't mean that we're all going to be experts in real estate, but you can't write about a subject like Ground Zero without talking about politics and land use and real estate, and you can't write about New Orleans without talking about those same things, plus, you know, wetlands restoration, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's at least an effort among a lot of us who are critics to realize that, and realize that, you know, one thing we can learn from, say, the Ground Zero, the failure of a lot of architecture critics to clarify the issues at key moments in the development of that rebuilding process, and try when the next disaster comes along to take a different approach.
But as the non-architecture person here, I'm sort of feeling myself getting very tight because it feels as though the conversation is among architecture critics. And, with Ground Zero, the conversation is enormous. With Katrina, the conversation is enormous. It can't just be a conversation among and for architects about what's going on in New York City or in New Orleans. I mean, if you're worried about what's going to, how the lower Ninth Ward is going to look or how the neighborhood around Ground Zero is going to look, you can't just focus on architecture critics. You gotta talk to the political reporters who are in the rooms every day talking to the people who are actually making the decisions that will result in something that you will eventually write about and that you will eventually criticize or praise. And so, if you want more writing about architecture in newspapers, the conversation has to go beyond the critics, and you have to find those people who are engaged in the conversation, even if it's peripherally. They're still talking about architecture or urban planning or design or something that you're interested in. And I say that the person who does that, and the person who is able to cultivate those relationships and maintain those relationships is the person who's going to be able to actually do what we all want, which is to have the everyday person understand and be engaged in what's going on around them.
But Jonathan, do you think that reporting belongs, or criticism belongs, within an arts section of a newspaper? Or should it be on the front page every day?
But it doesn't
Not called architectural criticism?
No, but what I'm saying is what's going to be reported is not architectural criticism. It goes back to actually what Dean Rubin was saying, which is process stories. Process stories are amazing stories because that's when you find out who made what decision and when and why and how that's going to impact a particular neighborhood. By the time you get to architectural criticism, a lot of the decisions that could have been rectified have already been done.
You know what, though, to go back to the Ground Zero example, because it's one that I've thought about and written about a lot, maybe nothing could have changed the course of the redevelopment, but, at the time that when that was unfolding, Herbert Mouchamp, as the architecture critic for the New York Times, was the most powerful critic of any kind at the New York Times. He had the most leeway. He was given the most space. Clarifying those issues, as I mentioned, if he had done that, that would have had the weight of as much as I respect David Dunlap and all the other urban affairs reporters who were covering that story really diligently, it would have had the weight of a dozen of those pieces. And it didn't, so sometimes, not always, but sometimes the architecture critic can be the one person who can bring all of those issues together in a single piece. Now, Herbert was not that critic. He was not interested in that process, but I think there are critics who do operate that way and can have that kind of effect and can be a kind of nexus for all of these issues.
We have a question from Michael Pelkin, and then I think Sean Kirst is going to jump in.
Yeah, that's a question basically related to the things I'm hearing from pretty much all of you, which is addressing interdisciplinary work. And I'm a great fan of the blueprint, having a European background, just coming from London, and I'm pushing for that kind of approach myself. Now I'm wondering how that works, looking from my design perspective, looking at your writer's perspective, asking where do you place that article? And maybe there should be something like a section called Life, or because it's addressing, not only where you live, how you get to the, dinosaur barbecue, and maybe people should know about buses and public transportation, all that kind of stuff. So maybe there should be a section called Life and how you enhance life and work with the community. But how do you, and what kind of risk are you prepared to take to step out of your common boundaries and say, I'm qualified to do this, but I'm making this jump to do something that you might be perceived as you're not qualified to do that, but you still believe you got to do it? Or how do you get over this boundary of category thinking and out of the box, basically?
Steve Litt, you were gonna jump in as well. Maybe there's an answer in this.
The question is how to get beyond the silos?
The boundaries problem, the category you use is a problem. And that's been acknowledged, apparently. So how do you try to get out of that categorized framework to reach out and get people to go with you, because I think the problem is that a lot of people feel like, okay, this is about urbanism, I don't know anything about urbanism, but then, yeah, talking about, how do you get to the dinosaur and how do you park and how do you get around, they start to understand.
Well, I'm just going to give you a really short answer. As an architect, for an architect who wants to get beyond that, you just do it. You just do it. And there are lots of people who are doing it. They're integrating their firms, or interdisciplinary. If you're a writer, you just do it. You face a lot of resistance. You face a certain amount of criticism. It's all that. I mean, but if you believe it's important, you just do it. And then I think in journalism, you're also going through different ways of thinking about how to create the newspapers and the magazines and all the print and broadcast journalism and everything, and shift your categories as well. But somebody's got to start shifting the categories, and a lot of people are doing it. That's the good news.
Steve Litt, maybe.
I want to draw together some threads here in the discussion about whether architectural criticism or urban design criticism should be solutions-oriented versus simply critical and negative. And I think those are two aspects that all writers have to explore. But I also wanted to relate it to Christopher's comments about Herbert Muschamp and his role in the Ground Zero debate. He was given this, he did have enormous leeway, and he was given the privilege of organizing a competition which was published in the pages of the Sunday Times Magazine, in which he chose the contestants, and some of them were actually vying for the real job. Are there boundaries beyond which a solutions-oriented approach and advocacy simply shouldn't go?
Well, I'll take that one quickly. I think there were some issues about Herbert stepping into that part of the process. I think it would have been easier to take had he been equally engaged in the other parts of the political and planning side of the story. In other words, if he had really been engaged and up to his elbows in all of the politics and all the real estate and the land use issues that were surrounding the rebuilding process, then it would have been a different issue in terms of his inserting himself into the design side. But I think it was the combination of those two that really rankled a lot of people, that he was unwilling to get into the real meat and potatoes issues, but willing to throw himself into the kind of the purely design side. That's my point of view.
One thing that you just said, Steve, just reminded me, and it sort of rankled me to the point where sorry, Janet, I mumbled to Janet, that on the one hand you had Herbert Muschamp, who is doing what he did for Times Magazine, picking contestants and having them design something, and meanwhile the actual process was going on. And that, to me, is the issue here. If architects and those who want to be architects and citizens are focused on the make-believe that's going on in the magazine and not paying attention to what's really happening, then, I mean, that's a problem for everybody. It's a huge problem for everyone.
Well, except for the fact that surely you could also look at the proposals of the actual developers or the actual people with a stake in the situation, and what they're proposing to do is also make-believe until it's built.
Well, I think that,
What Herbert was trying to do was to lead by his position, by putting forward his preferred half-dozen design firms so that they would give the blue sky, high level of possible design to surpass what I remember was a set of rather dreary, the public voted out all the proposals by, I can't remember which firm, but they did the Ellis Island or the Statue of Liberty, was it Bay of Belinda Bell? So that it was after that his proposals through this magazine showcasing was meant, as I recall, to give a kind of bigger vision of what could be.
And in the end, nothing happened. And in the end, the public didn't quite understand what was going on. When Libeskind won the competition from Raphael Vignoli in the middle of the night through something that happened, people saw this and they thought, wow, look at this, isn't it interesting? The buildings are going to look like this. They're going to be these little boxy things, and this is what's going to happen. And then suddenly, Libeskind got kneecapped, and somebody else was brought in, and folks were like, well, wait a minute, what just happened? What about those buildings? And no one understood that what Libeskind did was the master plan, and that there were architects who were going to come in and actually build buildings on the site.
I think we're about to hear about master plan and reality from Chancellor Cantor.
So I bring all that up just to say that when journalists as a whole are not focused on the process, in addition to architectural criticism, I think everybody loses out. And I think that's why there's been so much frustration in New York City about what's happened and what hasn't happened. No one knows what the hell's going on still.
I wasn't actually going to do master plan, but this is kind of a series of threads for me as a social psychologist listening to all of this. And it goes back to actually that story and Katrina and actually pieces of what Sean's saying here. And that is, what often is missing as a social psychologist is journalists taking on the difficult dialogues, if you will, across what are horrendous divisions in these older industrial cities or new sprawls of Phoenix, or, and I'm not accusing anybody of not taking on the moral voice, but that's tricky, right? I mean, the minute you start moving from buildings to the urban story, or the sprawl story, or the recovery story in Katrina, then you're really talking about the moral fiber of our society. Where is it? Where has it been? Where is it going? Who's taking responsibility? A little bit like David said about democracy, what scares me about the internet solution is, as a social psychologist, I can assure you, morality will get buried deep in cyberspace, and nobody will talk to each other. They will talk past each other. You just look at the blogs on any of our newspapers right now. I mean, talk about a kind of dissociated or disconnected world. That's it. So I guess if there's a question embedded in this, it's how do you shine a light on the urban story or the sprawl, whatever the story is, as a story about moral contestation, about people trying to cross boundaries, to bring history back, to have an optimistic, positive sense. Boy, I'm telling you, as someone who's moved here and loves this place deeply and tries to be really optimistic, you get hit in the face all the time by these guys. I mean, not Sean particularly, but I have to be careful here. But I do think that one of the bright hopes in all of what everybody's trying to do in these cities and where you are as well, Nan, is to really think about the kinds of weird collaborations that are forming. And part of them they're interdisciplinary, but they're also weirdly cross-sector and cross-neighborhoods and cross-race and cross-people and cross-class divisions and cross-expertise. Because every successful project that I can point to around here has a very weird mix of partners in it. So I wonder if that's a safe way to get to the story, Jonathan.
Well, I don't know if there's a safe way, and if there is a safe way, then it will mean then it will mean that it'll be a pretty dull story. But I do think that you raise a very good point, that what the perfect way to tell a story, no matter what story you're trying to do, is through a person. Mm-hmm. When I went to New Orleans, I wrote a column based on this woman who I just happened to run into while doing my second of 3 disaster tours. And she talked about where she lived, where she moved to. We went to her house. We saw what it was like. And there you got the economic story, you got the class story. You didn't get so much the race story, but her new home was in the lower 9th Ward. And then you had this immense American story, and this woman who had transplanted to this place that had been devastated and who had decided that damn it, she was going to stay, just like all of the other people around her. And she's living in a neighborhood where there's one other house. I mean, so, sorry if I'm not articulating myself very well, but, you know, I'm no architecture critic. I'm no urban planner, but I can tell her story in some way, peripherally tell the story of what's happening in terms of bringing that city back.
I'll take a swing at that too. Hey, I think in terms of, I think the northeastern cities, and there really is only one big moral issue, and that's that we've abandoned the poorest among us in the center of the city, right? And if I preach to readers about that, their faces will go blank, and I'll lose them immediately. They're gone, right? The only way I can do things is incrementally, and that is by trying to build bridges and reassure people. If I write a column where I say to people, wait a minute, you're afraid of Syracuse, but you'll park under the interstate right next to Pioneer Homes and walk to the Dome. No one messes with your car. It's fine. Then you hope that you step people back and make small progress. The other thing I wanted to say about just your question, really, it just seems, I mean, it seems to me like ridiculously obvious. How do we write about urban design? It's just got to become just part of the paradigm. It's just every story we write when they're building something, we should be looking for voices in the community who can speak intelligently about it the way we look for there was I won't use any names, but recently, not too long ago, a big project here where I was at a press conference and I asked about the design impact on a nearby neighborhood. I swear to God, one of the big politicians in town says, I think we should leave architecture to the architects. You know, look what's happened that way. But, but
Sean, you're the only one who can say that in this.
yeah, but you know what I'm saying, right? I mean, we could at least ask an architect what the deal is, you know? My other point I would make is, and this is just one of my favorite examples of urban design, is in our town, the biggest debacle was where we put our stadium. We put our baseball stadium on the outskirts of the city in the middle of a big parking lot. It's a disaster. It ought to be downtown or at least somehow within the urban fabric. And I banged about that, and I haven't been real gracious about letting people forget it. But I could never exactly make people feel the mistake in that. And a friend of mine in town, an architect, I'll redeem myself here, said, it's not the issue of where it is. He said, it's the issue of the parking lot around it. All of us who've ever gone to baseball games, the thing you remember as a child is when it still works with Fenway, right? It's when you're in an urban setting, and you know, when you're in Boston, you're walking down the street and there's a hubbub and there's trash in the streets, and you walk into Fenway, it's that explosion, right? It's sensory. And when you put a ballpark in the middle of a sea of pavement on the outskirts of town, you lose it, right? And everyone who loves baseball knows that when you write it. And it seems to me steps like that are what bring people into the game.
And on that inspiring note, let's take a break so we can start again promptly at 4. Thank you.
Mute off? Oh, mute off. Okay. Well, hello. Welcome back. Good afternoon. I'm Julia Zerniak, and I'm associate professor here in the School of Architecture and a soon-to-be director of UPSTATE, which is a Center for Design, Research, and Real Estate here in the School of Architecture. What I'd like to do very briefly in the next 3 or 4 minutes is to say a few words about UPSTATE before introducing this afternoon's moderator, Johanna Keller. As Mark mentioned, this event, UPSTATE Writing the City, follows UPSTATE Public-Private and UPSTATE Downtown as the third in a series of symposia which gathers together individuals whose disciplines interface in ambiguous yet significant ways with design, such as policymakers, public representatives, real estate developers, and of course, journalists. These events aspire to increase communication and potentially, hopefully, collaboration between individuals that shape the city. And in doing so, intend to demonstrate how good design does not just look like something or simply be in the world. good design works as a catalyst of transformation, a highly leveraged instrument for positive change in built environments like upstate New York. Now, geographically, upstate is a very vague region. By some accounts, upstate is anything, well, north of the Bronx. By others, the state has 4 lateral tiers, and upstate is characterized by a band of cities running from Albany to Buffalo, of which Syracuse, a prototypical post-industrial city that has lost 37% of its population since 1950, is a part. Interestingly, the 2000 census ranked 641 of the largest U.S. cities by the greatest loss of population. And Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, and Utica are in the top 20, with Buffalo leading the ranks with a close to 50% drop in population. More expansively, the area of upstate study is greater than within New York State, and it aspires to advance a set of design strategies for working in urban cores that were once in America's heartland and now in its Rust Belt. Nonetheless, as those of us who heard Saskia Sassen's talk last night, although the work of Upstate focuses on this region as places to act, the Center's research agendas, qualified as they are by economy, politics, and policy, will look to larger context to understand places like Syracuse through the frame of what she termed global circuits, which are links of specialized services and practices extricated from specific material economies. So we are interested here in the center in nested scales of inquiry. It's not accidental then, and this occurred to me recently when I made my business cards, that when Mark Robbins named this initiative, he didn't simply name it Upstate, but cleverly Upstate : and as we all know, and there's so many writers in the room, a colon is a punctuation mark consisting of 2 equally sized dots, and in the font Arial they come out as squares, on the same vertical line. A colon informs the reader that what follows proves, clarifies, explains, or simply enumerates of what is referred to before, or for my purposes here, that something important follows. So it is with this formation we understand Upstate as a dynamic entity that will strive through its research initiatives, sponsored events such as this one, public outreach efforts, and design work to be committed to both action and to bridging between the what of innovative design and the how of getting things done. So I'm now pleased to introduce Johanna Keller, who'll be moderating this afternoon's session. Johanna is the founding director of the Goldring Arts Journalism Program at the Newhouse School here in Syracuse. Now in its 3rd year, the Goldring program was the first cross-disciplinary program at an accredited school to teach journalists to write about the arts and culture, including architecture. In addition to her 30-year career in New York City as a critic, journalist, and editor, Johanna has become known as a national activist for arts journalism and was one of the prime movers in hosting the first National Conference of Art Writers in Los Angeles in 2005. So please welcome Johanna Keller.
All right, thank you. This has been an extraordinary day, and I just have to say again to Mark Robbins what an amazing force he's been here in Syracuse, as well as Nancy Cantor, our chancellor, who have both done so much to bring design and awareness of community and a sense of excitement of development here to Syracuse. I'm relatively new to Syracuse. I arrived 3 years ago, and 4 years ago, actually. And I was going to have some remarks that actually have been already said and said better by today's first panelist. So I'm going to just add another comment about what I'm hearing. When we started our thinking about founding the Goldring Arts Journalism program here at Syracuse University, one of the first questions to come up was, what do we call it? Do we call it art criticism? Do we call it journalism? What exactly do we call it? And for me, this was a no-brainer. Journalism was absolutely the right term. The reason being that when we're training writers, the path to great criticism is through journalism. And it's my theory that for the problems that we see in criticism and writing about the arts in this day and age, a lot of it can be laid at the door of critics who begin to write criticism, to write opinion, without the underlying foundation of journalism, without understanding all of the kind of topics that in architecture, as we discussed today, have to do with technical aspects, political aspects, social aspects, that in fact a great critic has to first be a great journalist. In the day of the blogging that we're seeing today and the day of the internet, we're seeing an awful lot of opinions, thin opinions, batted around, and it seems that the truism that everybody's a critic is never more, unfortunately, true. So what I'm hearing today is just a wonderful kind of antidote and a reinforcement of the idea that we need a criticism of criticism itself. We need to get back to the fundamentals of what a great critic does, which is to know the subject very, very deeply from all aspects, to be able to do investigative reporting, to ask the hard questions before opinions are formed and put forward to the public. So I just want to say that I myself am a music critic, and what I heard today is really music to my ears in terms of what the work is that's being accomplished in this country now, and especially to see it in the realm of architectural writing. I want to get now to introducing our panelists for the afternoon, who are a really starry and wonderful bunch. They are, in reverse order, Robert Campbell, Julie Iovine, Fred Bernstein, Stephen Litt, and Dana Cuff, who will go as our first presenter. Dana Cuff is a professor of architecture and urban design at the University of California in Los Angeles. She has written a seminal book, Architecture, the Story of Practice, that many of you have probably read and have on your bookshelves. And her most recent book, I had a read at it, and it's really quite wonderful, The Provisional City. Elegantly written, incredibly insightful, and it analyzes urban transformation through public and private housing projects in Los Angeles. This is an extraordinarily important aspect of writing about architecture because of its vast size. Housing projects take up a great amount of land in the urban scape, and it's important that we deal with those kind of built environments. So, without further ado, Dana Cuff.
Thanks. There's no nicer compliment than someone from outside your field saying they read your book and thought it was well written. Let's see, can we get that first image then? Coming to Syracuse last night, I felt like I had made the right choice in switching my topics at the last minute. You know, for an academic, no, it was the one before that. To get 15 minutes means you really think about one idea. I'm used to talking for 3 hours at a time. God forbid that anyone would have to listen to that. But I started this 15-minute thought on this image, Syracuse Builds, because I was thinking also about Rome and how it is that we start to portray the transformation of a place today. And this, I think, image is extremely powerful about what Mark Robbins has in mind here and why everyone's so excited about what's going on at Syracuse now. And it ties back to what Mark was saying about food, actually. And that is about 5 years ago, I heard a review of The New Joy of Cooking. The New Joy of Cooking? And it was on NPR, and they were saying, well, how have the recipes changed? And the author said, or the editor, well, we had to take out all the Jell-O and all the Campbell's soup. And after that, we basically had the same recipes. And so I thought, well, actually, you know, when we're creating our stories, our narratives about the city today, we have a new kind of Jell-O and Campbell's soup that are part of the ingredients. We're not really working with fresh materials any more than The Joy of Cooking is. And I think one of the most interesting prepared foods of contemporary journalistic writing about the city is the satellite image. So I just want to talk about satellite imagery today, and particularly about Google Earth. I think these are, in fact, narratives. I'd like to say that they are a kind of writing already, and ones that particularly intrigue the public imagination. So I took the second part of the, after the colon, after the writing the city colon, is how public media is shaping, how media is shaping public opinion or public imagination. And I really think that the satellite image is an important part of that. This came to me, I'll start with a couple personal stories as well, especially since I'm supposed to represent the West, which I was going to just let Christopher do. But my family has a ranch in the midst of San Diego County. And 2 weeks ago, when we were up in flames, literally, we were trying to track what had happened to our particular place in San Diego County. And I was watching the news and tuning into the radio, and I used every form of media possible to try and figure out what happened to our place. And me and about 40,000 other people who weren't able to be at our homes during that time were really just trying to see if our place had burned up or not. These kind of images, like the one on the left, was what you were seeing on television, and then the satellite imagery started coming through, which was pretty frightening because you couldn't tell where those smoke trails were coming from. And it turned out that the integration of data, we go through fires regularly there, so 3 years ago we didn't have this kind of data at all. The integration of NASA data, of fire department data, of news data was incredible, so that you could pinpoint down to your road, down to your part of the aerial survey, exactly where the latest fire data was. So we were all, I actually had a sister in Dubai, one in Washington, D.C., and one in Salzburg, and we were communicating the entire time, trying to find out what happened to the place. And it turned out that the best stories available were ones on a blog, a series of blogs that everyone in San Diego County eventually found, where a few people were integrating, mashing up the data, basically from satellite imagery and fire department data, down to the street level so that we could see what was happening. And I have no idea who the guy is that's behind the And Still I Persist weblog, but he not only put all that stuff together, but started analyzing it and translating it in these images on the right, showing us exactly where those fire trails had gone at the end of every day. And when you woke up, he'd already worked on the nighttime's data. So he's probably back at his job as an insurance broker for the car industry now, but at that time, he was like my man on the fire. The only other story I'll tell you about this is a project that I'm working with through City Lab, which is something like UPSTATE, though much smaller operation, but a think tank I've started at UCLA in Los Angeles, about how architecture and urbanism, and experimental and innovative architectural urbanism might be emerging in the next decade. And we have a lot of projects. Some of them are writing books, and some of them are symposia, but this one happens to be in a small town in East LA called Pacoima, where they have some incredible lots and a tremendous need for affordable housing. So I've been going to Pacoima a lot, trying to explain how this incremental infill project, a series of single houses that you might add behind other houses on large lots, would operate. It's almost unfathomable to the people of Pacoima, from the city councilman on down, exactly what we mean. And I was showing them these maps, their own maps. This is a CRA map. And also showing them photographs. Whoops. Let me go back one. like this of what these lots look like, and still it was hard for people to picture what it was we had in mind as a long-term strategy. And I was talking to the chancellor about that with your connective corridor, how complicated it is to get across urban ideas. I think it's much more complicated than it is to get across architectural ideas, because you can't use a photograph to explain it. We've long complained about the single photograph for architectural illustration. I really think that that's a factor of 10 when you talk about urban projects. So even the photograph didn't work, but when we started looking at the I can see my house from here kind of image, which is really what's embedded in these aerial photographs, like, oh, that's my backyard, or that's the Salazar's backyard, or that's the Bergdahl's backyard. They start to see what the, and these are slightly enhanced aerial photographs from Google Earth. You can start talking about design issues, which I'm not going to speak about specifically here, in much more specific ways that give people, the public imagination, access to information. Information that they relate to their personal lives and that allows them to make decisions and draw conclusions that are more relevant to the kind of information that they have about their neighborhoods. And the closer in you can zoom and then pull back again, which is the sort of one of the beautiful features of Google Earth, the better off you are. So I just want to talk about 5 qualities of these satellite images and what that might enable for those of us who are writing about the city. As you probably know or feel, Google's mission is to make the world's information universally available and useful. It's an incredibly broad mission, and they seem to be accomplishing it. Now there's a Google Earth for Mars, right? In fact, the universe is now part of the satellite imagery. But I think that the first part of this really comes from the world is my oyster kind of model that Google Earth gives you. And there's a tremendous quality to that. This is one of the early satellite images. This comes from Apollo 17 in the 1970s. The first image of the world as a globe from space was in the late 60s. It's not unrelated, and I would like to demonstrate that the phenomenon of Google Earth isn't a radical transformation of all that we've known, but in fact, there are interesting precedents for this, a way of seeing as a way of enabling the city or the world to exist in our imaginaries. Aerial photography was clearly the first. The geographer Dennis Cosgrove writes really eloquently about this in a book called Apollo's Eye, in which people's understanding of cities in regions really comes about in that period between the wars, when oblique aerial photography gives you a point of view into the relationship between the landscape and space. And in the end, a viewer is able to claim that narrative to a certain extent by virtue of having that point of view. A second quality that is really insipid and difficult to overcome for anyone who's worked with Google Earth imagery is the fact that the imagery is only skin deep. It's an entirely surface-based model of the world, meaning that you barely get topography out of it. It's like we are just one topographic skin. So you get a little bit of topography in a place like Boulder, where there's a horizon that can be seen over the Rocky Mountains. But most places are perfectly flat, and so it becomes very complicated to work architecturally off of those. Now, the idea that there is a certain kind of information embedded in our mapping type imagery is fundamental to all maps, as Italo Calvino eloquently put it in his Invisible Cities stories. But you might remember, even from these kinds of maps of the 17th century, how it was really a story of ports and navigation, and the inland territory meant almost nothing. And so what we saw was implicitly what we knew was important. And I think that aspect of Google Earth's implicit prioritizing or privileging of the surface is something that one would want to be critical of as we begin to use this tool to enhance our public sensibilities. Google Earth had a competition recently that some of you may have seen, which is the attempt to integrate the software, modeling software SketchUp with Google Earth. And so they had campuses modeled. This is Jan's campus, University of Minnesota, and the Frank Gehry building there. But you can see how all of these buildings are hovering over the ground because you can't actually locate anything on the ground itself. So you see there's really no connection to the ground, and then when it does hit the ground, the way SketchUp works, it just sinks down to whatever level it can go to. So actually finding ways, I mean, partly I'm thinking about this as an understanding of the world. I'm also thinking about it the way we as designers are using it to demonstrate various aspects of the urban environment. It has this limitation that makes it complicated to use as we might have used other kinds of mapping tools because it's so surface-oriented. A quality that I think we're all familiar with is the mine all mine principle, which really comes from all the mashups that are being made online. They're really incredible. If you just type mashup into Google, you go to website after website of people's favorite mashups. This one happens to be bars where you can get drunk in Moscow but not pay too much. And every one of the little blue blips, I mean, again, as a designer working with these things are really hard to overcome. So this icon is in every Google Earth map mashup unless you write some kind of really special code. So what's embedded in the Google Earth system is pinpointing a place on a surface that then unleashes other kind of information. In this particular case, photographs of the bar, which is very helpful, right? You think, well, would I want to go to a bar that looks like this or one that looks like this? That is actually a way for a tourist to begin to see, or a student or whomever, how to work your way through Moscow. And I imagine there's hardly anyone who travels anymore who doesn't Google Earth the setting first. I mean, I could Google Earth Tibet before I went, which is really an incredible access to a customized version of the world. That idea of the sort of itinerary, like the world is the way I see it, is one that's long been embedded in, say, the travel sketch, or even just which photographs we showed, or the itinerary, whether it's Choisy's or Le Corbusier's, or in this case, the Silk Road. And speaking of the Silk Road, I think another quality of the satellite imagery and Google Earth in particular is what you might call Marco Polo's hubris. When Marco Polo was on his deathbed in the 13th century and the travels of Marco Polo had been written, he was asked, or so the story goes, is there anything that you should change? Is there anything you'd like to change about your stories of China? And his answer was, no, I have not told even half of what I saw. And I think that notion of the way we describe the world, that it isn't, in fact, we never imagine ourselves to be comprehensive. We tell a world that seems comprehensive, but there's always more that could be told, but we never know what it is. And I think in particular that's problematic in Google Earth. So here's Prague in a 360 kind of click-in world mashup. And you don't really know if that restaurant that we're seeing on the right is an advertisement or a critical review. It's impossible to dig down within the websites to find that kind of information out. On the one of Moscow, it's such an ad hoc kind of personal story. You think, oh, this is some guy who drinks a lot and loves Moscow, and that's what I'm hearing is his personal view. With these kind of sites, you think, I wonder how much you had to pay to get the 360-degree camera to come. Or then there's public sites, you think, well, maybe it's partly sponsored by the city. But what we don't know is never clear, and the sense of it being total is fundamental, which is a really interesting device for a journalist, because when I look at Syracuse, I think, boy, Mark Robbins has it all. You know, that's a pretty incredible portrayal to be able to make. This idea, of course, has also switched to some of these other views now that are in Google Earth Street View, which I'm sure many of you have experimented with. But again, the idea of its being comprehensive that's Pittsburgh, and all of Pittsburgh just about has been driven through and photographed, is similar to the ideas of all the kinds of maps we make, mapping in and of itself a kind of narrative story. Some of the ones that interest me are these surveillance maps that you sense every camera in the streets of Manhattan have been documented and recorded, and we take a kind of faith. There's a kind of faith that's embedded, I think, in a map, and even more so in a satellite survey, about the authenticity of those images. So the last point I want to make has to do with the illusion of authenticity. This is a particularly interesting image because, in fact, it demonstrates that Google Earth is indeed tiling together of different images photographed over time from different points in space. It's not a snapshot the way it feels, as if it's the world as I click on it, which I really learned during the fire events as well. That idea that, in fact, Google Earth not only can manipulate the world, but we manipulate it. So that's Mount Everest, which you can hardly find because of the tiling over time based on different seasons and times of day and snowfall. Then we have the Nazca Lines, which you can find in Google Earth, which is kind of cool. And then there's Santa. Santa was found, supposedly, in Google Earth, and someone's written up, various kinds of stories about how it got there, but it's not clear to me whether or not the world was manipulated for Google Earth, which is possible, just in the way that Nan was talking about those really beautiful images of the field being manipulated for an aerial photograph. It gives it a kind of shock value and authenticity inherent to the medium. Similarly, I think the global warming stories are all the more powerful because they're manipulated into our views of actual Manhattan. So maybe it's too low on the screen, but these views of the same exact image that we see where taxis are now are flooded shows and demonstrates the real implications of that. And I only want to bring up one more point, which I'm glad Jan Abrams didn't mention. It's something that she introduced me to several years back, which I think is a beautiful project that talks about the way we might start writing literally using satellite imagery. These are called GPS writings by an artist named Jeremy Wood. And you'll see this quote, "It is not down in any map, true places never are," from Herman Melville, through GPS tracings that Jeremy made in the landscape under the auspices of the Design Institute. And these kinds of tracings have actually become mechanisms for understanding all kinds of, not just artists' practices, but all kinds of urban activity now that we see in different experiments. So I think I'll leave it with that and only say that the medium is there to be manipulated even further. We need to be aware very consciously of this as part of our urban imagination, and that it has certain biases embedded within it that can be both turned to our interesting, productive writings about these images, or can affect us without our tacit or without our explicit awareness if we're not being conscious of them. Thanks.
Thank you, Dana. Oh, true confessions. I never have played a video game, but Google Earth, I have spent a lot of my hours of my life running around Google Earth. It's really terrific. Thank you so much. That was fabulous. Our next speaker is Stephen Litt, and I'm very excited that he's here. I probably shouldn't confess this, but I ran across his writing as a juror for the Pulitzer Prizes and was really, I'm sorry to say he didn't win, but I was taken by his writing very much. It jumped off the page. It was vivid. It was writing that expressed a real city narrative and a real care about what's happening in Cleveland, a city much like Syracuse. Steve Litt joined the Plain Dealer in Cleveland as the newspaper's art and architecture critic in 1991. He held the same position in the News and Observer in Raleigh, North Carolina. He has degrees in art and also in journalism. Good background. And he has been a fellow in curatorial studies at the Whitney Museum in New York City. He also writes for Art News, Metropolis, and other magazines. And he's going to talk to us about what's happening in Cleveland, Cleveland City on the Bubble. Steve.
So right is forward. Great. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I've been having a marvelous time. This is a fantastic event. Mark, thank you so much for organizing this, and Johanna for your very kind introduction. As I've been listening to all of this, I've been thinking about all the alternate talks I could have given and probably should have given. But what I will do is hope that we have more detailed conversation about architectural journalism, criticism, urban design criticism, what have you, afterwards. And I will present a case study of Cleveland and where the city is right now. I think in circumstances very similar to Syracuse, but moving forward in a different way. The title on the bubble I drew from an expression that I believe comes from poker, which means that if you're on the bubble, you might be eliminated in the next round of betting because you hold a weak hand. Cleveland is shrinking and distressed, but still a wonderful place to live, and its future depends on decisions in the current round of betting. Which include major investments in architecture and urban design. I was very interested in Julia Cherniak's picture, map of the same region. I think about this constantly. I think what's happening in Cleveland is typical of many cities throughout this region, which is described by the geographic demographer Joel Garreau in his 1980s book, The 9 Nations of North America, as the Foundry. Despite the decline of traditional heavy industry in Cleveland, we have tremendous assets on which to build the future, including the arts. And I show you the Cleveland Museum of Art here. We have the Cleveland Orchestra. We have fabulous educational institutions, the Cleveland Clinic, which has been ranked #1 in heart care in the United States for the past 13 years running. We have tons of affordable real estate. I'm sure you know all about that in Syracuse. And we have lots and lots of fresh water, which I think will be a crucial asset in the 21st century. And if there's one thing that I think we should all unite upon in this room, it's that not one drop of water ought to be exported outside the watershed of the Great Lakes. Thank you. Please remember that. That's a big political issue. In Cleveland, obviously, we have a lot to live down. We've got our lovely winters, lake effect snow, and the persistent image of environmental blight left over from the Industrial Revolution. I'm sorry this is a little blurry, but all you have to do is follow the downward slope. This is our population over the past century. We peaked in 1950 at 914,000 and have since descended to close to 400,000. So that's a big psychological issue for Clevelanders to carry around. We've lost a lot of traditional manufacturing, particularly in steel. And the subprime lending crisis, about which we haven't said much at this conference so far, has hit the region very, very hard. This is a map of vacant properties in the city, and this is from a story that I didn't write, but part of the urban reportage that we do. This is about what do you do with these properties? Who cuts the grass? Who maintains the roof when the bank takes over? And some of our neighborhoods are reverting to prairie. This is a picture that could have been taken possibly in Youngstown or Detroit or here in Syracuse. And the social fabric of the city is ripping apart. Violent crime is on the rise. These are friends of a 12-year-old girl named Stevie Cookie Thomas, who was cut down by crossfire in a shootout between members of rival gangs after going to the candy store. She stepped outside and boom, she was killed almost instantly. This happened over Labor Day weekend, and this is one of those impromptu memorials which are becoming a very common sight in our city. And yet, you can't count us out. To quote the Monty Python line, we're not dead yet. This is from a recent story based on a study released by the Brookings Institution, which ranks Cleveland 19th among global metropolitan areas in per capita contributions to the gross domestic product, just behind Paris and one ahead of Portland, Oregon. The article also noted that the 5 contiguous counties of Cleveland and the surrounding 4 have 2.1 million people, accounting for 23% of Ohio's economy, so not to be taken lightly. And I think the idea of that, the idea of this story is that the Brookings Institution wants to make urban policy more of an issue in the coming presidential campaign, which I think is a great idea. The problem in Cleveland always has been how to strengthen the urban core, and we've tried many schemes over the years with very mixed results. This is an urban renewal plan designed by IMP in 1961, the Erie View Plan, and like the proposal in Dunkirk that Sean Kirst described this morning, this was only half built, but the 200 acres was demolished all at once. So we had what we called Hiroshima Flats lying around for many years. In the 1970s and 80s, we had a wonderful birth of a historic preservation movement in Cleveland with the renovation of 5 historic movie palaces in Playhouse Square. And we built the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. You all know about that in the mid-90s, along with sports stadiums for our 3 major league teams and other tourism-oriented attractions which pulse people in and out of the downtown without leaving any discernible benefits. We still have a lot of thinking to do about our lakefront. For a city on a lake, we've done remarkably little with the waterfront, perhaps because we face north in comparison to Chicago, which faces east and has the prevailing northwest wind at its back. Our lakefront is dominated by an airport, railroads, highways. So the city really doesn't come down to the water's edge. The river is still very important. Cuyahoga River is very important to the steel industry that we have remaining in the industrial flats south of downtown. But as you can see, we have miles of riverfront on the Cuyahoga that are lying fallow. This is an incredibly fascinating and beautiful geography with many, many layers of history, and I've written about quite a bit of it. The Ohio and Erie Canal started right here. This is Lock 1 under the this RTA. This is our regional transit viaduct, and under the high-level bridge that carries from Superior Avenue over to Detroit. Fantastic things down there awaiting a future. The same is true of the Cuyahoga Valley south of Cleveland. I wrote a series of articles 7 years ago about the reclamation of the right-of-way of the Ohio and Erie Canal, which runs right through this landscape, and it's just taking an incredibly long time to get that project done. It could transform many neighborhoods bordering the valley. We're doing some incredibly stupid things, and I like to present this to all audiences interested in architecture. The Cuyahoga County bought this building. This is a Marcel Breuer's only tall office tower completed during his career, built in 1971 for the Ameritrust Bank, and the county wants to tear it down to make way for a new administrative center. And as a result of the asbestos abatement, they've already destroyed this beautiful window in the main banking lobby. I tried to rally national attention to this, but didn't get enough of a response to light the fires locally. But you know, I tried. That's my job. That's the job of a critic to do that. Another thing that I've been writing about a lot is this terrible highway project that we have in Cleveland, $1.5 billion redo of our major highway arteries downtown. I've tussled with the Ohio Department of Transportation on many occasions. This thing is going to be, this will attach a tourniquet to downtown transportation for 15 years and damage the city in ways that I've been trying to point out to people. One of them is that this boundary between the downtown, you can see our Gateway Sports facility here, this is Jacobs Field, and neighborhoods to the south, this artery is going to be hardened, and there won't be enough money in the budget to do the kind of capping that Christopher Hawthorne described in his talk. And $1 billion is going to go for the replacement of this bridge. This is I-90 over the Cuyahoga River, which is a very close cousin to the bridge that just collapsed in Minneapolis in terms of its design. On the positive, in terms of infrastructure, the Regional Transit Authority is building a dedicated busway 4 miles from Public Square downtown to University Circle, which is our arts and education hub. And this has spurred many projects along the way. There's now $2 billion worth of investments along the right-of-way, including this $500 million heart center at the Cleveland Clinic. Unfortunately, the architecture is not always rising to the occasion, as we can see here. But among the really exciting investments is a $258 million expansion and renovation of the Cleveland Museum of Art. All privately funded, I must say 90% privately funded, which shows that there is still quite a commitment and a belief in this city. And I wanted to talk about how universities are adopting neighborhoods and building these college town developments. I think Syracuse University has here has a different model with scattered sites. The Case Western Reserve University assembled 8.5 acres near its campus. This is going to be a mixed-use development with housing in these blocks here, a new Museum of Contemporary Art here, an expansion of the Cleveland Institute of Art, a new rapid rail transit station here, a park over the tracks, retail, supermarket, housing, what have you. And the design aspirations are very high, and I hope we'll all be hearing about this nationally, because this is a fantastic model of collaboration among private developers, cultural institutions, the university. It is modeled somewhat on the South Campus Gateway at Ohio State University. This is, Dean Robbins was talking about North High Street in Columbus earlier today. This is one of the projects that has, I think, operated on the displacement model. There were a lot of people living and working here before, but it was very run down. There was a murder here in the mid-1990s, and so the university assembled all the land and turned it into this very contemporary-looking lifestyle center, I would say. Now we have the University of Cincinnati, which is another model. This is in the core of the university, and what's exciting about it is that 3 architecture firms, big contemporary firms, are working together around this urban space designed by Michael Hargreaves to create public space, which is the really important thing here, not the individual buildings by Charles Gwathmey here and Moore, Rubel, Udell, and Tom Main over here, but it's the public space that really matters, and that's what excites me about that. We have the opportunity for that kind of thing to happen here on the Triangle, which is this development within walking distance of the Cleveland Museum of Art and Severance Hall, home of the Cleveland Orchestra. So this is one of the things that I've been covering a lot online and in print. Stanley Seidowitz has been hired by the development team to do some of the housing, and Office Da is collaborating with them, Office Da from Boston. So you're seeing very high design aspirations here in what will be, I think, a very desirable place to live. And Farshid Musavi of Foreign Office Architects will do the Museum of Contemporary Art building. And Vinny Mas of MVRDV just contributed this design for the expansion of the Cleveland Institute of Art. So in conclusion, I think Cleveland is a place worth fighting for. It's a place with a future. I believe in it, and that's what motivates me in my practice as a critic. Thank you.
I'm really struck by the parallels still between Syracuse and Cleveland. Very, very similar. So many things that are the same. Great. Our next speaker is Fred Bernstein, and he studied architecture at Princeton University and law at NYU. I think that's a great combination for someone who's writing about architecture to understand law. So many times politics and legal issues come into the writing of architecture. I noticed his work first in the New York Times, where most of my music criticism has appeared over the years, so I read bylines really closely, I have to admit, and I always enjoy his work there. He's also written in Dwell, Metropolis, Metropolitan Home, and other magazines. He's taught writing at the Missouri School of Journalism and at NYU at law school. He's going to talk today about shelter magazines, Gimme Shelter, text and subtext, and home design magazines. And I think this is a really interesting topic. I myself have taught newspaper journalism as well as magazine journalism. The two things are very different. Magazines are animals that combine image and text. Newspapers are much more text-oriented because of their daily because of the expectation of reader partly, but also because of their daily deadlines. Design is something that does take more time and is possible with magazine journalism. So I'm very excited to hear what Fred is going to tell us about shelter magazines. Fred.
Thank you very much, Johanna, for that nice introduction. And thank you very much, Dean Robbins, for inviting me to be here. It was very nice to hear from Stephen about Cleveland. A couple of years ago, I wrote a story for the New York Times about Canton, Ohio, which is quite close to Cleveland, and where the depopulation has been so severe that perfectly nice houses are on the market for $8,000, and still there are no buyers, which is remarkable. But my topic today is very different. My topic today was suggested by the letter I received from Dean Robbins inviting me to be part of this conference. The letter pointed out that there are very few, almost shockingly few, architecture magazines in this country. Apparently, we have even fewer than Malta. The other day, I went to Grand Central Station trying to find some serious architecture magazines. Grand Central Station has one of the largest newsstands in the country. I didn't find any serious architecture magazines there. Mostly I found home design magazines, which are sometimes known as shelter books. There are a lot of them, and they sell millions of copies. And I've written for many of them, as have some other members of the panel. These shelter books, which are our de facto architecture magazines, are a mixed bag. The most popular ones often look like this. They feature design tips from Deborah Norville at the bottom of the screen and Soledad O'Brien. Their mainstay is the suburban single-family home, which is often 4,000 square feet or more, sometimes much more. Everything about these magazines encourages the McMansion lifestyle, with garages bigger than the house I grew up in. These magazines are, in that respect, profoundly anti-urban. But some of the magazines are better than others. Metropolitan Home, with which I've had a 19-year association that I'm proud of, is largely about urban living. Here's a typical Metropolitan Home story about an urban loft. It happens to be about a loft in the Crossroads district of Kansas City, Missouri, but it could be in any American city. The article is similar to hundreds of articles that have appeared in Metropolitan Home and similar magazines over the years. First, you see the owners, who frequently are gay. In this case, they happen to be a straight couple. That's Bradley and Linda Nicholson. You read in the text about how hot their neighborhood is becoming. This particular story, which I didn't write, says, and I quote, Not too long ago, their neighborhood was downtrodden. Now it's a buzz. A buzz. And you see some terrific architectural details. I happen to really like this wet bar, which is a fine example of minimalism in the heartland. But there are several things you don't see in this kind of story. First, you don't usually see any children. The owners of these lofts, whether gay or straight, are nearly always childless. Second, you don't see floor plans, sections, or any of the other representations that would help you know what the architect was thinking. Third, you don't see the exterior generally, except perhaps a close-up of the building. You certainly don't see the surrounding neighborhood. You don't learn anything about what we've been talking about today, namely what city, state, and federal agencies are or aren't doing to improve the public spaces right outside these windows. This kind of story is very different from a look at Deborah Norville's weekend house in the Hamptons. This kind of story does encourage urban living, which is a very good thing, but it is still about interiors. It is not about the public realm. Noticing what's missing from these articles helped me formulate some questions that I hope you'll find useful, whether you write for these magazines as I do, publish work in them if you're an architect, or just pick them up at the airport. First, the absence of children. That absence leads me to wonder if these homes, no matter how nicely they're presented in the magazines, are expected to appeal to the typical American family. The text is about how great the neighborhood is to live in, but the subtext may be, yes, but only if you're outside the mainstream. Second, the absence of plans, sections, and other architectural documentation. That absence leads me to wonder if these stories communicate architectural ideas as well as they could. Do architects whose projects are published in these magazines feel that what they do as architects has been adequately explained? And third, the lack of attention to the outside, to the neighborhood. That absence leads me to wonder, do these articles promote thinking about the public realm, or are they almost as inward-looking as the stories in Traditional Home and Country Home and all those other shelter books? Is this kind of article just another manifestation of the American obsession with private domains so large that you never have to think about anything beyond your four walls? With those questions in mind, I started looking back at some articles that I've written and some that I plan to write. Here's a project I wrote about for the New York Times a couple of months ago. It's an old firehouse in New Haven, Connecticut. It was renovated by Gray Organchi Architects of New Haven. The owners are Megan Craig, who's a painter, and Nick Lloyd, who's a musician. And it's in the neighborhood called 9th Square in New Haven. And first I want you to see how the architects presented this project to me. First of all, this beautiful section which shows how this is the street entrance, how the building became, first of all, a performance space, second of all, an apartment for Megan and Nick, and third of all, a bar underground which is reached from the street level. This is the bar underground, which I think is very beautiful. This is all from the PDF that was sent to me by the architects who were hoping to get the project published. This is the performance space, which I also really like. And this is how the architects presented some of the decision-making that went into that design. This is a ceiling that can be tuned, in effect, on those tie rods. It's a ceiling of flexible plywood sheets. And these are also diffusers. This is plywood cut into strips that can be tuned for acoustical purposes. This is one of the diagrams they sent me. And now I will show you the kinds of photos that ran in the New York Times. These are the owners, Nick and Megan, in front of the building. This is their apartment on the top floor. This is their kitchen area. This is their bedroom. And this is their rear terrace, which they've turned into a beautiful garden. The photos are great. I was very proud of the story. They were happy with it. but I have to say the architectural ideas weren't necessarily communicated by these images. And there was very little discussion of what was happening in the neighborhood, which included the abandonment by a major developer of plans to revitalize several adjoining blocks. There simply wasn't room in the article to get beyond Megan and Craig and their apartment and their garden. Was it worth it for the architects to be published in this manner? I asked them the other day and they said yes. But still they wish they'd had more options, more serious architecture magazines they could have taken the project to. Here's another project I published in the New York Times. I'm sorry the images are so small, but it's a terrific house in Brooklyn by Margarita McGrath and Scott Oliver. They call their firm No Roof Architects. And in this article, there was more discussion of the architectural ideas, in large part because the architects, Margarita and Scott, designed this house for themselves. That meant that when I interviewed them about their home, they talked about the architectural ideas. They weren't drowned out by the homeowners. They were the homeowners. There was also a great deal of discussion about the public realm because this house had one very simple idea behind it. The design was generated by their desire to keep that beautiful tree in front of the house. They actually could have built out to the lot line, and they chose not to because they wanted to save the tree. I remember Margarita saying, and I quoted this in the story, "It's not our tree, it's everybody's tree." So their sense of what they were trying to accomplish both architecturally and in terms of urbanism was strongly communicated in that particular story. Here's another, a couple more details, very small. That's the interior of that house. This is their kitchen. There's a detail that I happen to love. The security bars that they needed at the back glass door slide over and become the ladder that you use to get up to the loft bed, which is over the kitchen. I'm really fond of that. Here's another project that I published recently. This one was in Dwell magazine. That's Tad Beck, who's an artist who lives in Los Angeles. This house is very close to USC. That's his dog, who I believe is named Bear. The architect of this project is Riley Pratt of Marble Radziner Architects, a very good firm in Los Angeles. This is the building that Tad bought. Incidentally, he teaches at USC, and USC has a program that I haven't heard of at any other university in which faculty and staff get grants from the university if they buy houses within, you have one, I'm looking at the chancellor. I'd love to hear about it. If they buy houses within certain designated areas directly surrounding the campus, they get really substantial grants, not just loans. So Tad bought this industrial building. This is what the interior looked like. It was a kind of warehouse. And this is an aerial view. As you can see, the building is hemmed in on three sides by other similar buildings. And on the fourth side, it faces a very busy street. So Riley Pratt had a terrific idea, which was to put a courtyard in the middle of the building and create a semblance of California living, sort of patio living, but in this warehouse building. And this is the courtyard that was built in the center of the former warehouse. This is a schematic that shows you what Riley was trying to do. He essentially built an apartment inside the building. The building has very high ceilings. So he was able to build this raised apartment, and then the area around the apartment is Tad's art studio. So that's Tad's studio down below and the apartment up on the platform. This is the kitchen area. This is the bedroom. I notice it's the same bedspread that the couple in New Haven had. I've only seen it twice in my life. This is one of the pages from Dwell magazine. You can see how it was presented in the magazine. Of course, you don't see the plan or any of the schematics, but you do see a lot of the rooms. That's the kitchen. That's Tad's partner, Sean Smith. I don't know, trying on an outfit for a party he was going to that night, literally. And here is a picture of Tad in the living room. And here is Tad getting ready to walk his dog outside his new home. When you look at this story, do you think enough of the architectural ideas were communicated? Do you think that the story presented the context, so you had some idea of what's going on in the neighborhood, how the neighborhood is getting better, how it could continue to get better? Those are some of the questions I ask myself. And now here's a story I'm going to be writing for next week's New York Times. In fact, I think you'll see it next Thursday unless something changes. This is a loft in Boston, in Chinatown. The architects are Mijin Yoon and Eric Howler, and they call themselves Howler and Yoon Architects. It's an apartment on the top floor of a 6-story building in Chinatown, and the apartment gets quite a lot of light, but even so, the floor plate is very deep, so the architects decided to try to bring light down into the apartment from above with 3 openings. One of them is a courtyard, which, by the way, looks remarkably like the courtyard we just saw in Los Angeles. You can see the setting in Chinatown in Boston. In fact, you can see the pagoda. That's one of the gates of Chinatown. In the distance, you can see a brand new apartment building by Office Da. And you can see new parks. It's part of the Rose Kennedy Greenway. Those are some of the parks that have been created as a result of the big dig. The highway was buried, and there are brand new parks. So this story, I hope, will have a lot to say about the neighborhood, not just about the interior, but also about the context. Shower, bathtub, those are the light wells, in effect. Those are the owners, Sam Duvall and Leslie Duvall. He is the cellist with the band The Magnetic Fields. And one thing you see in this story, children, there are actually 2 children. Here's their daughter. So this story will be in next Thursday's New York Times. And when you read it, I hope you ask yourself a couple of questions. I hope you ask whether the story depicts urban living in the way you think it ought to be depicted, as not just for people who are outside the mainstream of society. Ask yourself whether the story expresses enough of the architect's ideas, and ask yourself whether the story includes adequate discussion of issues pertaining to the larger public realm. I don't claim that this kind of story makes up for the absence of serious architecture magazines, but if it accomplishes the 3 things I just mentioned, it's done a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. That was great. It's always good for us to remember that a lot of architectural and design writing has to do what we call in the business aspirational writing, right? So, I mean, this is fulfilling aspirations of readers, and there's a huge market for that, actually, and it does have a big place in writing about design and architecture. It's way terrific. Our next speaker is not from that world. Okay, Julie Iovine is the executive editor of the Architect's newspaper, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and she's been the architecture critic there since 2004. I first knew her writing in the New York Times, again, my hometown newspaper for 35 years, and before that, she was the magazine editor for Metropolitan Home magazine, so she has had shelter experience. Yes, okay. She is the author of Michael Graves, The Guggenheim, and Chic Simple. And I was having a conversation just at the break with Bill Mencken from Architect's newspaper, and we were talking a little bit about the rise of the internet and the way in which the internet people have approached the publication and asked for all of your information so they can put it on the web. And it reminded me of how important really good journalism and really good writing about architecture is, that it's the content providers of high-level writing that really are contributing, not the mode of distribution, but really the content providers. So, Julie, you're one of those. Please.